Athens, the center of Greece. Since the 4th century before Christ, power struggles have rocked this cradle of democracy. 2,300 years ago, Athens was surrounded by city-states. Some, such as Macedonia, were regarded by the Greeks as impostors, barbaric imitators of Greek culture. Macedonia's King Philip II was a brilliant leader, determined to transform his uncouth city into a civilized state acceptable to the esteemed Greeks. Eventually, through battle and diplomacy, he united all the Greek city-states with the exception of Sparta. It was called the Corinthian League. Philip had several wives, including Olympias, daughter of a king. She bore Philip 2 children, Cleopatra and Alexander, who became his designated heir. Philip devoted himself to his son's education, but the boy was uncontrollable and defiant. By the time Alexander was 13, Philip realized he could be reached only through persuasion, not force. Philip summoned Aristotle to be Alexander's tutor. On this terrace in the small town of Yesa, Aristotle taught natural science and politics to Alexander and other sons of nobility. They recited Homer and reveled in stories of gods and heroes, such as Hercules. The young men trained in the games of war. Once King Philip refused to buy Alexander an unruly horse, 13-year-old Alexander saw that the distraught animal was merely afraid of its own wild shadows. He quickly calmed the beast and earned his horse. The pair shared adventures for the next 15 years. King Philip took a new young wife, forsaking Alexander's mother Olympias. Philip and Alexander became estranged, then briefly reconciled. At the wedding of Alexander's sister Cleopatra, tragedy struck. As Philip entered the amphitheater, he was stabbed to death by a Macedonian noble. Alexander, now 20, was chosen Philip's successor by the Macedonian army, who by tradition had the deciding vote. The new king appointed Hephaestion, his closest friend, to a high post, and exterminated many relatives he considered a threat. Alexander's mother Olympias joined the fray, killing Philip's infant daughter, then forcing the new wife to commit suicide. For the rest of Alexander's rule, no one dared challenge him. But he was not readily accepted in his father's stead as the head of the Corinthian League. Alexander mobilized his army to convince them. He marched his troops through the Greek states towards Athens. Athens capitulated. Alexander ruled. He renewed his father's vow to avenge Persia's destruction of Greek city-states in Asia Minor. Alexander began by securing his own borders, pushing invaders from the north back to the Danube. News of Alexander's terrifying successes reached the new Persian king, Darius III. Desperately, Darius offered the Corinthian League gold for protection. All but Sparta declined. Nearer home, false rumors of Alexander's death on the battlefield encouraged some of the Greek states to revolt. It was a catastrophe. Alexander had to respond. The city-state of Thebes was demolished, sacrificed as an example. But it enabled Alexander to pardon the rest of the rebels without negative consequence. Alexander's small Macedonian state dominated all of Greece. His next opponent was the great Persian Empire, which included the coastal regions of Asia Minor, Egypt, the Middle East, the core of Persia, the northern areas between the Caspian Sea and the mountainous regions of India and West India, to the valley of the Indus River. Alexander's army was inferior in numbers and in financial backing. Its future was dim. But Alexander was so confident that he brought an historian into battle to document his victories. The two armies met in Issus, on the coast of the Mediterranean. Darius allowed himself to be cornered. He positioned his troops with their backs against the sea. With one end of his troops anchored against the shoreline, Alexander led the attack. He exhorted his greatly outnumbered troops. "Our enemies are men who for centuries have lived soft and luxurious lives," he reminded them. "We of Macedonia have been trained in the hard school of war and vigilance. And finally, you have Alexander, and they, Darius." The daredevil tactics of the Macedonians overcame the traditional, ponderous and slow Persian war wagons. Alexander fought his way to King Darius's chariot. Darius fled the field in panic. Greece and Macedonia were declared the battle's victors. The war had begun. The Greeks pursued the retreating Persians and massacred them. Darius left his mother, wife, and daughter on the battlefield. They were a prize of war more valuable than gold. Alexander showed mercy and spared them. He pushed on to Egypt. The empire of the pharaohs had suffered under Persian rule. Alexander arrived as its liberator. The Macedonian marveled at the culture's great achievements. He cloaked himself in Egyptian dress and crowned himself pharaoh. He also founded a city in his own honor, Alexandria. Then he decided to stall his run after Darius and make a pilgrimage to the oracle at the oasis of Ammon. Alexander had heard that Perseus and Hercules, the sons of Zeus, visited there. Before he took his war any further, Alexander wanted the blessing of the gods and their help. Alexander and his small troop wandered in the desert. According to legend, a god in the form of a snake appeared and led them to the oracle. Alexander was a respecter of all religions and deeply superstitious. He followed oracles, but also used them to confirm what he had already decided to do. At the oasis, Alexander went through the small courtyard and entered the holiest shrine, a room about 10 feet wide and 20 feet long. In this sacred chamber, he could put his questions directly to Zeus, the father of all gods. After his visit, Alexander referred to himself as the begotten son of Zeus, forsaking Philip. The new son of God and Pharaoh hit the road once again in pursuit of Darius. Alexander's army trudged on. He might have become a god's son, but he led an all-too-mortal army, ill-equipped and impoverished. The Macedonian treasury was so small, Alexander had paid for the army's outfitting with his own funds. Alexander strategically counted on the riches of the Persian territories to feed his troops. They did. To haul their plunder, the Greeks relied on great herds of beasts of burden. Camels could go for 10 days without water. Scouts were responsible for locating encampment sites. There were more than soldiers to accommodate. Doctors, cooks, jugglers, animal handlers, even traders. Blacksmiths brought along their forges. There was frenzied activity before battle. About 200 weapon makers were employed. A bronze helmet of the Macedonian warrior is one of the few perfectly preserved pieces of armor from Alexander's time. Alexander gave his troops new orders. They headed east, their goal, Mesopotamia. Darius waited there with a large, fresh army. October 1st, 313 BC. The Battle of Gaugamela commenced. According to ancient precedent, Darius stood in the center with his chariot, his mounted guard, and the infantry around him. Having stood watch in full armor all night, his soldiers were already tired. Alexander's troops had eaten and slept well in their encampment. But Alexander was unwilling to steal a victory at night. He led the attack at dawn. As the Greeks overran the Persians, Darius panicked and again forsook his troops on the field. The Persian army was destroyed. Alexander eventually pursued Darius, but once again, the shrewd Persian king eluded him. Alexander turned south toward Babylon, which made him king. From there, he continued to the Persian city of Susa, through the Persian gates to Persepolis, and on through the mountains to Ecbatana, the last Persian capital. It had been 6 years since Alexander had begun his campaign. The Greeks' desire for revenge had faded. Alexander replaced it with a hunger for conquest. After centralizing his government in Persia's outer fringes, Alexander turned his eyes toward the east. His ambitions were now bankrolled by the Persian king's captured treasury, over $10 billion in today's currency. Still, victories were hard won. Taking heavy casualties, Alexander made slow but steady progress through Persia. He sent soldiers behind the enemy's lines. It was a costly way to keep the enemy's rear occupied while Alexander attacked from the front. The Persian infantry turned and fled, but the Greek mercenaries within their ranks begged Alexander for mercy. He denied it. Over 2,000 years later, nomads live and work on Alexander's battlefield, and their footsteps walk the ground where soldiers once trod and died, or lived to march and fight again. Gathering supplies for 60,000 people was common. Local provisions were procured through trade or plunder. Women and children were part of the formation. While the men carried their weapons and tools, the women bore the family's bedding. Alexander's army marched 16 miles a day on level ground. Since there were no maps, the steps of the journey were counted, so they would know where they were and how far they had gone. Diplomacy was often Alexander's first strategy. A stone carving depicts a diplomatic mission to the Persian king 2,500 years ago. The king held court from his throne. According to Asian custom, his feet were never to touch the ground. Alexander adopted this practice. It was both an acknowledgement of Persian history and custom and a bold statement that placed him at the level of their king. The palace buildings of Persepolis, ceremonial center of the Persian Empire, were built on artificial terraces 60 feet high. King Darius had written on the side of the great temple, "This land of Persia, which is fair, rich in men and rich in horses, trembles before no enemy." Now, in January 330 BC, Alexander approached it with 60,000 men. For years, he had encouraged his troops with talks of plundering the most hated city of his enemy. After Alexander secured his own riches from the palace, he gave his troops free rein to steal or to destroy. Men were murdered. Alexander demanded that the women, stripped and robbed of their jewelry, be spared. Crazy with greed, the soldiers fought between themselves over the limited spoils of war. And then there was fire. At a raucous celebration banquet, a beautiful Greek courtesan teased Alexander in a final act of revenge. The Persians had once invaded Greece and burned her temples. Now it was payback time. Alexander allowed the courtesan to lead his drunken guests by torchlight through the palace and to burn it to the ground. Alexander came to his senses the next day. Shaken, he realized his uncharacteristically thoughtless act had destroyed his own palace. Alexander knew that as an enemy he could never rule over this land. He reconciled with the Persians and took on their style of dress and their customs. He adopted the formality of Persian royalty. Seated in a throne, his feet did not touch the ground. He received supplicants who greeted him in the Persian fashion, putting their hand to their mouth. It all made Alexander's colleagues chafe. They prided themselves on their culture's superiority and hated the idea of assimilating with anyone. "10,000 donkeys and 5,000 camels were requisitioned from the local populace as transport for the plunder. The army journeyed north. The trail is still traversed by nomads today. It is still perilous. This pathway now can hold 20 animals abreast. But in Alexander's time, only 2 horses could ride side by side. It took Alexander's army several weeks to cross this pass. The trail is steep and unmarked. As it winds upwards, temperatures drop quickly. Nature continues its role as the perpetual enemy. In the spring of 330, Alexander's column moved north and ran into a blizzard. They were accustomed to the desert and prepared only for its blistering conditions. There were heavy casualties. Alexander finally reached Ecbatana. He set up his government and declared the end of the war against the Persians. He presided over 2 separate courts, one Greek, one Persian, and drafted Persian soldiers into his army. After 5 years of conquest, plunder, and destruction, Alexander had no intention of returning to Europe. Alexander was established in Persia. Hoards of gold and silver were minted into coins bearing his likeness. He wanted his portrait with the horns of the Egyptian god Ammon to be carried to every corner of his empire. Bookkeepers tallied the fabulous sums that were the fortunes of war and the means by which the war was perpetuated. But only the equivalent of $350,000 made it home to Macedonia. The rest was kept back to sustain Alexander and his army. War made Alexander the richest man of antiquity. Assimilating Persian officers into his staff alienated him from his old friends. His leadership was criticized. The Greeks held the Persians in low esteem, believing them to be no more than wealthy, uncivilized barbarians. Finally, his army was comprised of only 1/4 Macedonians and Greeks. One historian wrote that Alexander's melting pot politics led to conflict within his own ranks. During a banquet, Alexander got into a shouting match about his new Persian ways with Cleitus, a family friend. Both were very drunk. Alexander lost control, his infamous temper raging so hot, a bodyguard hid his sword. Infuriated, Alexander grabbed a guard's dagger and thrust it into Cleitus, killing him. Alexander became distraught after the murder. He lay his dagger against the wall, intent on falling on it. Losing nerve, he took to his bed, where he stayed, sobbing and refusing food or water for 3 days. Despite his remorse, Alexander stubbornly carried on with his strategy of conquest and assimilation. Veterans were encouraged to settle new cities. Border towns, trading centers, government offices, all were systematically created, and all bore the name Alexandria. Alexandria on the Nile, Alexandria in Arachosia, in Aria, Eshote, Alexandria the farthest. Alexander founded 70 such cities in Persia. On the Oxus River on the border of Afghanistan and Tajikistan, a sensational find of the Alexandrian age was found. A war chariot made of pure gold. Gold was stored in the temples. The holy places were Alexander's banks, strewn across the empire. Darius had been murdered. It appeared to be an inside job. His body was discovered by one of Alexander's officers, bound in gold chains inside an abandoned wagon. Alexander wrapped his old enemy in his own cloak and sentenced his assassins to death. It was a soldier's duty, and Alexander was every bit a soldier. He asked no more of his army than he was willing to give. Straggling through the last of 3,000 miles of desert, his men were starved and parched. Alexander shared their misfortune, refusing water. When the Oxus River was finally reached, an observer noted, he stood by their route and refused to take food or drink or refresh himself until the entire army had passed him by. Captives and new enlistees from conquered lands added to Alexander's enormous retinue. From an initial force of 15,000 unencumbered men, there were now 60,000 or more, a small city on the move. Women of the defeated nation became slaves, concubines, and lovers in the Macedonians' camp. Alexander encouraged his troops to intermix with native women. It was a popular order. The men had been away from home for many years. Families were created, children born. At one point, 10,000 of them lived with the caravan. As Alexander's Persian mistress prepared to deliver him a son, Alexander fell madly in love with Roxanne, the daughter of a defeated Iranian prince. Alexander's marriage to her was a convincing gesture of reconciliation and a matter of national pride, since the wedding was performed according to Iranian ritual. Their passionate union inspired art and literature for centuries. The mountains and desert of northern Persia led to the steppe, the land of the fabled Amazon women warriors. One legend relates how Hercules proved his mettle against an Amazon. Another claims Alexander was visited by the one-breasted Amazon queen, whose sexual appetites kept him busy for over a fortnight. The reality of the Asian conquest was far more intimidating. The treacherous mountains now known as Hindu Kush separate India from Afghanistan. Hindu Kush means Hindu killer, a name acquired during medieval times when thousands of Indian slave women perished in their trek through its passes into Iran. No one expected Alexander to attempt crossing them in the winter, but he did. From Ekbatana, the finance and government center, the army marched into the area now known as Afghanistan. For 2 years, the war was fought along its border. Alexandria in Marjana was one of the cities founded. In 327, the journey continued over the Hindu Kush to Pakistan. According to Greek myth, from here, the highest peak, one could view the ocean and the end of the world. But reality met myth in icy mountains and glaciers. The Greek name for this range was Paropamisus, meaning peak over which the eagle cannot fly. And since there were no maps, Alexander's staff relied on myths to direct them. They believed if these mountains contained an eagle, as locals insisted, they must be in the Caucasus, where Prometheus and his eagle were known to reside. Prometheus had stolen fire from the gods and given it to man. As punishment, he was chained to a mountain where an eagle preyed on his liver. To Alexander, the marks of his chains were apparent on the craggy rocks. So without real geographic orientation, Alexander's army made its tortuous route into the valley and into the unknown. Unable to get his bearings, Alexander again referred to Greek myths. Dionysus, the god of wine, supposedly traveled as far as India. Alexander found grapes similar to those grown in Greece in the mountain countryside around Nysa. Alexander assumed Dionysus had planted them. The landscape was reminiscent of the idyllic Macedonian countryside as well. After years away from their homeland, the soldiers had stumbled upon a place that felt like home. Alexander felt a kinship with them and guaranteed their chief his position. Alexander is still alive in the tales told by the Kalish, a tribe immersed in ancient traditions. They proudly believe they are descendants of the Greek Macedonians who arrived in this area generations before Alexander. Tales from their forebears assured Alexander that Dionysus himself had indeed founded these villages. And in typical Dionysian fashion, the Kalish entertained his soldiers with a bounty of food and wine. It was a welcome change from having to battle for domination. This is a mountainous area at the foot of the Khyber Pass. To this day, the Kalish continued the tradition of commemorating their dead with wooden totems and putting them in coffins which are not buried. One enduring legend recalls Alexander's troops ruthlessly smashing the above-ground caskets and using the wood for fires. The mythical wealth of India beckoned Alexander, and so did the specter of a new land he'd only heard about. Strange customs, unfamiliar plants and animals, red-eyed unicorns, people copulating in public, humans with dogs' heads. Alexander continued to walk in the footsteps of the wandering Dionysus, but his men were exhausted. Alexander addressed his soldiers with missionary zeal, invoking the name of Hercules. Hercules was the son of Zeus, who had attained immortality by completing 12 difficult earthly assignments. Alexander urged his troops to do the same. He cited Hercules' relentless perseverance as he exhorted his men to scale 8,300 feet to the top of a perilous mountain. 30 men fell off. But the enemy capitulated at the sight of those who reached the top, a feat far beyond most mortals. Elephants were consigned to military duty, helping the army reach the Indus River in the spring of 326 BC. In homage, the Indian lord of Taxila sent Alexander so many transport elephants the Macedonians thought they were being attacked. The army crossed the mile-wide river. Alexander's journey was no longer fueled by the desire for revenge against earlier foreign transgressions. He was searching for the end of the world, which was rumored to lay at the far side of India. In India, Alexander met the people he dreamt of. People who continuously prayed, meditated, and lived a modest life. People who put up no resistance. Alexander allowed the Prince of Taxila to remain lord over his lands in gratitude for his loyalty. "Why should we war against each other?" Alexander asked. "You won't withhold from us what we need to survive." Indeed, the beautiful prince gave Alexander everything he wanted. Alexander's men entered the city fearfully, aware of the lurid predictions made by the Greek Herodotus writing of the Indians' customs. When a man is sick, he will be killed by his best friend, and then he is eaten. And with a sick woman, the same transpires. And if one is old, he is happily sacrificed and eaten as well. The Indians were a different sort of enemy indeed. The Greeks' fear of being eaten by Indian cannibals proved without merit. In fact, the Greek and Indian styles blended smoothly with one another, becoming the unique Gandhara culture. The image of the Trojan horse was rendered by Indian stonemasons. Cassandra, a mythical Greek prophetess, shouts her warnings about the legion of soldiers hiding within the horse. Here, Alexander's face is rendered in characteristic Indian style. Alexander was fascinated with Indian culture, but he remained apart from it. Although he had embraced many of the Persian customs in an attempt to create a new homogenized race, he was patently uninterested in doing the same with the Indians. Instead, he focused his energy on maintaining his military strength and upgrading his army's dwindling morale. Eunuchs dressed in women's clothing were brought into camp as entertainers and artists. Dance fests and drinking bouts were planned to raise the weary spirits of men who had been away from home for a decade. A team of experts from Greece and India kept the elephants battle ready. If the 60-odd animals were not bathed daily, they would become grumpy. In battle, they trampled everything in their way. They could understand up to 25 commands, and they were often used to torture or execute enemies and traitors. In June 326 BC, Alexander moved his troops against the shrewd Indian king Porus. He encamped on the banks of the Oedipus River. Again, Alexander's brilliant, untraditional strategy meted victory. While one group maintained its position on the opposite bank of the river, Alexander took a select force across the river 17 miles downstream from Porus's camp. His attack was swift and a complete surprise. It was the first time Alexander's army had encountered elephants in battle. Porus's infantry outnumbered Alexander's 5 to 1. Alexander's infantry swung axes at the elephants' legs and slashed their trunks. 50 were felled. The rest stampeded wildly, picking up men and crashing them to the ground. Porus threw everything he had to the front line. The battle was decided when Alexander called in his cavalry. Alexander's main charge attracted all the enemy cavalry to one wing. Then, Alexander's troops charged them from the front and back. Badly wounded, Porus capitulated. Alexander asked the fallen Indian ruler how he wished to be treated as he was carried to his surrender. "Like a king," was Porus's proud reply. Impressed, Alexander reinstated him as a Raja and kept his kingdom intact, guaranteeing Porus's loyalty in future conquests. Alexander kept his eye eastward, toward the end of the world. His vision was no longer shared by his troops. They were exhausted, badly supplied, and demoralized. They saw no point to the campaign. Many resigned. Others stayed but griped. Mutiny threatened. At the Boas River, Alexander's empire reached its farthest limit. His soldiers would no longer follow him. A delegation met with Alexander. He defended his plan eloquently, but unsuccessfully. One of Alexander's own generals spoke for the men. "Do not lead us against our will, for we cannot show the same determination if we lack enthusiasm," he told the Great One. In a fit of rage, Alexander sequestered himself in his tent for 2 days, hoping to force his troops to reconsider. Their stubborn silence was humbling. In a face-saving gesture, Alexander publicly consulted the gods. The gods told Alexander to go home. The news spread like wildfire. Orders to load the booty were given. Teams built altars to give thanks, then decamped. Alexander ordered his doctors to stockpile anti-venom for the long trek home. More men were thought to have died in India from snake bites than battle wounds. Phoenician carpenters were summoned to build ships. A ship's wharf was established down the Indus River at another new Alexandria. 5,000 cavalry and 7,000 armored infantry arrived as reinforcements. Although the war was over, they would have to fight their way back out of India. The army who had fought halfway around the world floated downriver in 800 ships, fearful of attack. They just wanted to go home. A bloodless return became just another myth. Cities were no longer capitulating to simply the reputation of Alexander's forces. Armed conflict was inevitable. The Greeks were beyond exhausted, but Alexander pressed them on. In one engagement, he led his warriors up a ladder placed against the walls of a fortress. Just as he jumped into the castle, the ladder broke. Alexander was quickly surrounded and hit by an arrow. His soldiers rescued him, closely averting capture. Undaunted, Alexander was back in the saddle within a week. His next target, the southern cities of the Indus Valley. The enemy was itching for a fight, but Alexander's victory was no longer a foregone conclusion. The Macedonian magic was gone. From Alexandria on the Indus River, Alexander divided his army into 3 sections for the journey back to Persia. The rationale was simple. Divided and returning by different means increased the chances that some of the men would make the trip all the way back home. The northern unit went west and met up with the southern contingent. Alexander moved through the old city of Patala. From there, he went overland through the desert. The third unit set sail, following the coast into the Persian Gulf. It was a chaotic journey. Alexander led the caravan through the desert. It was a catastrophe. Temperatures soared to 127 degrees during the day. Although the plan was to march at night, day travel was often required in order to reach the next watering hole. Pack animals had to be killed and consumed because there wasn't enough water. The desert claimed more victims than all the battles put together. 3 out of 4 men did not survive the 60-day march. It was Alexander's final humiliation. Back in Persia, Alexander put his house in order, distributing power among the conquerors and conquered. Then on June 10, 323 BC, he died. Some accounts attribute his death to fever. Others alleged it was poison. A question was posed to Alexander on his deathbed. To whom would he leave his kingdom? To the strongest, he gasped. Roxanne closed his eyes and kissed his lips to catch his departing soul. After 11 years on a campaign to conquer the world, Alexander the Great's empire died with him.